The public is being conditioned to look at the sky for missiles and at the sea for carrier groups. Media fixates on proposed golden domes and tracks every massive U.S. war fleet. This is a deliberate misdirection. The kinetic cost of symmetric warfare is a luxury our balance sheet can no longer afford. The math is irrefutable. With a national debt approaching $38 trillion and poised to grow faster than the economy itself, a prolonged conventional conflict is a mathematical impossibility. A solvency crisis is, according to internal watchdogs, almost inevitable. An adversary does not need to sink our fleet. They only need to bankrupt it. The primary vector is not a hypersonic missile. It is silence. A sudden, total, systemic silence. Analysts at RUSI and CSIS have modeled this. The severing of sub-oceanic data cables and the blinding of satellite constellations. The target is not our military hardware, but the data that gives it coherence. This attack protocol is designed to create a specific state, the blind Leviathan. The U.S. military and economic apparatus is a colossal organism, but it is entirely dependent on a nervous system of data. Cyber attacks against critical national infrastructure are not about simple disruption. They are a targeted neurotoxin. The objective is to induce paralysis, severing the state from its financial markets and its global command and control grids. For an adversary, this is the pinnacle of asymmetric leverage. It bypasses our kinetic superiority entirely, trading a multi-billion-dollar anti-ship missile for a few $100,000 in cyber capability. It transforms our greatest strength, our networked economy, into our most critical vulnerability. To understand the motive, you must reframe war not as an act of politics, but as an act of solvency. According to analysis from institutions like CSIS, Russia's kinetic operation was not a choice, but a mathematical function of its own domestic liabilities and the pressures of an unpopular war. When a state's balance sheet is insolvent, it is forced to export risk. This is the blueprint. Adversaries now apply this same blueprint to the United States. They see a nation deploying massive war fleets to the Middle East, a projection of immense kinetic power. But they also read the public data. They read the watchdog warnings that a crisis is almost inevitable, that a systemic liability of $38 trillion is set to grow faster than the economy itself. This isn't a secret. It's an open vulnerability. The enemy's calculus becomes brutally simple. Why confront the carrier group at a kinetic cost of billions? That's a symmetric trap. The strategic vector is to bypass the fleet and directly target the liability. The motive is to trigger the pre-existing solvency crisis. This forces a pivot to asymmetry. As analysts at E2E Assure would confirm, the primary weapon becomes cyber warfare against critical national infrastructure. The objective is not to defeat the U.S. military, but to make affording it impossible. Economic weakness becomes the primary accelerant, forcing a desperate state to choose between bankruptcy and a disproportionate kinetic response. The motive is to engineer an escalation trap. The math doesn't lie. The strategic calculus has inverted. According to analysis from the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, the kinetic cost exchange ratio is fundamentally broken. A state invests $5 million in a main battle tank. An adversary can achieve a mission kill on that strategic asset with a $500 first-person view drone. This is a 10,000 to 1 cost asymmetry. The math does not lie. This phenomenon is clinically termed the democratization of violence. It is the systemic erosion of the state's monopoly on high-impact force projection. The barrier to entry for inflicting strategic damage has collapsed. The same economic logic applies directly to non-kinetic vectors. A multi-billion-dollar power grid, the circulatory system of an entire economy, is vulnerable to a handful of operators. This is the blueprint for asymmetric attacks on critical national infrastructure. A nation facing a systemic solvency crisis, with a national debt reported at $38 trillion and projected to grow faster than the economy itself, cannot sustain this model. Deploying a massive war fleet or funding layered missile defense systems becomes an exercise in fiscal futility when the threats are cheap, distributed, and functionally infinite. Each conventional asset becomes a liability, an economic bullseye. The mathematical certainty is this: you cannot indefinitely defeat a $1,000 problem with a billion-dollar solution. The U.S. cannot afford to symmetrically counter every low-cost threat. Therefore, the strategic protocol must shift from attrition to escalation. The economic liability forces the state to find leverage not in endurance, but in a disproportionate, terminal response. It is the only option left on the table. The primary operational theater is no longer a physical location. It is a network. CSIS analysis confirms that adversaries now treat regions of high instability not as strategic objectives, but as proxy laboratories, staging grounds for low-cost, high-impact asymmetric attacks against an adversary's core economic function. The objective is to exploit a systemic solvency crisis. While the U.S. projects power by deploying massive, high kinetic cost assets like a carrier strike group to the Middle East, the adversary's primary weapon is a geopolitical cyber attack on critical national infrastructure. The cost differential is the entire strategic calculus. These gray zones provide a firewall of plausible deniability. An attack that cripples a financial system or power grid launched from a third-party state bypasses conventional deterrence. Proposed defenses like a Golden Dome, missile shield are strategically irrelevant. They are a hardware solution for an economic and digital problem. This staging method creates the escalation trap. The U.S. national debt, now projected to grow faster than the economy itself, makes a prolonged symmetric conflict fiscally impossible. When a non-attributable cyber attack inflicts catastrophic economic damage, the kinetic response cannot be proportional. It must be disproportionate to serve as a deterrent, radically lowering the threshold for a launch-on-warning protocol. The ultimate escalation protocol is not triggered by a missile. It is triggered by a loss of data. CSIS reports detail the launch-on-warning doctrine, a zero-sum protocol where a retaliatory strike is launched upon detection of an enemy launch before impact. This Cold War logic creates the primary asymmetric vector for a modern adversary. Intelligence on geopolitical cyber attacks targeting critical national infrastructure confirms this risk. An enemy does not need to defeat a carrier group. They only need to blind the radar. This creates the fog of digital war. The commander, staring at a dead screen, is forced into a binary choice. Is it a glitch or a decapitation strike that has already neutralized satellite warning systems? The protocol demands a launch based on ambiguous data. Out of fear, the arsenal will be destroyed in its silos. The cyber attack becomes the kinetic accelerant. The deployment of massive U.S. war fleets is a strategic diversion. Adversaries recognize that the true vulnerability is not our kinetic power, but our systemic liability. With the national debt approaching $38 trillion and set to grow faster than the economy itself, a solvency crisis is, as one watchdog warns, almost inevitable. This economic fragility is the new center of gravity, and our adversaries' war plans are being recalibrated accordingly. The logical asymmetric response is not to challenge our military head-on, but to accelerate our economic collapse. According to RUSI, the most effective vector is geopolitical cyber attacks against critical national infrastructure, CNI. The kinetic cost is zero. The potential for systemic disruption is total. An attack of this nature creates an escalation trap, forcing a response from a state that can no longer afford a protracted conflict. The calibration forecast. Within 10 months, expect a coordinated, non-destructive shutdown of the digital logistics network governing the Port of Long Beach. This will not be an explosion. It will be a 72-hour systems glitch affecting container ship manifest, crane operations, and trucking dispatch. It will be masked as a sophisticated criminal ransomware attack, making state-level attribution politically impossible. This event is a calibration shot. It is designed to measure the rate of economic contagion from a single point of failure and to test the U.S. political will to escalate to a kinetic response without definitive proof. It is a field test of our primary thesis, that our economic weakness is the accelerant lowering the threshold for global conflict.